In this whiteboard lesson, we're going to focus in on the literature review. And the literature review will typically be your second main section in your final document. So, the literature review, and as the name implies, it's where you review the literature that is relevant to your study. So you'll have done some of this in your proposal. You'll have had to demonstrate that you've done some pre-reading to get to a topic and a problem statement and some research questions. But in your final report, the literature review is a comprehensive overview of the landscape of all the relevant research and academic published work that you need to have demonstrated some authority in understanding and relating to your own research. So, as I've done in the whiteboard lesson for the full final document, always think about what is your end product. Your end product over here is a set number of pages. It's a main section, however long it's going to be. Quantity doesn't really matter too much. It's quality that matters. So, what I want to sketch for you here is a mindset for how you think about the landscape of relevant literature. Now, you'll most probably have dived into a specific topic that you're interested in. And for whatever reason, it's good that you have that interest in the topic, but you'll need to just take a couple of steps back and understand the relevant topics that converge to create that specific and detailed research problem or statement that you're trying to investigate. So what is quite useful is to think about it like a Venn diagram. So a Venn diagram will have a number of overlapping shapes, typically circles, and let's say you've got three main different areas that are relevant to your overall study, but it's really only the intersection of all of those three out of which you develop your hypothesis, your research problem, your research questions, etc., and which you will go into in some detail. And remember, it's very important for you to demonstrate that there's a gap in the literature. And often it's only in this multidisciplinary world where topics converge that there is enough depth for there to be some gaps in the literature. And if you combine enough of these different areas, you're most certainly going to find some gaps in the literature, because just those different combinations haven't been investigated yet. And when you find a gap in the literature, something that hasn't been investigated, that's where you can create some knowledge. That's where your study adds to our knowledge about the world. So whatever these three topics are here that converge to form the narrow field in which you're going to do some research, you need to be thinking about the landscape of your literature that you're going to review in that section. So what I like to do is call these A, B, and C lines of inquiry. And those lines of inquiry are going to draw the reader in from the broader world that they live in and ultimately help them get closer and closer to your topic of interest. And you'll have jumped around in each of these different topics, and I have another course on referencing and how you manage all the literature that you will ultimately need to reference in your final report. But that's the technicalities of referencing, and that's how to maintain a library of literature. But the way in which you construct a literature review has got to take this landscape into account. So the lines of inquiry really need to be introduced at the beginning of your literature review. So imagine sequential flow of pages or subsections in your literature review from start to finish. You would need to start off with some sort of intro about A, B, and C and say, in the literature review, we're really going to look at these three main areas, and then you have to decide in what sequence you're going to tackle them. And one tip is to remember that you'll have just completed your introduction up here. So what was the last topic that you left the reader on? And is there some continuity between the end of the introduction and the beginning of your literature review? Not essential, but it's just a nice way of ensuring some flow and continuity between the previous section which is your introduction, then leading into your literature review. So introduce those lines of inquiry, all the main fields of your literature review, and then decide how you're going to sequence them. So maybe it makes more sense to do C first, and then B, and then A. Okay? And in each of those sections, you need to demonstrate some, in an academically confident voice, because you're now the expert in this field, even more so potentially than your supervisors, and your examiners will be looking for you to demonstrate that confidence in how you have engaged in the literature and how you have come to grasp it and understand it, and also demonstrated there's a gap in it. So very importantly, introduce the 3 different fields, lines of inquiry. You may have 3 or 4 or 5, doesn't matter, but don't make it too complex. Group it at a fairly high level. And then you need to show between A, B, and C how they interplay to form this specific niche in which you are going to be doing your research. And in here, you then need to clearly show why the combination of these 3 different areas then opens up an opportunity for you to extend our knowledge about each of these, but with a very narrow field that requires you to understand all of them. And then at the end, you need to just summarize what you found in each of these. So maybe there were 16 papers over here that you thought were relevant, 23 there, and 19, for example, over there. And then you summarize, or you show some themes between each of those major papers or sources from the literature. You've then combined each of those in a synthesis of these main lines of inquiry, and then you've summarized that, and you've shown at the end of that literature review a good academic treatment of the literature, a synthesis of the 3 main areas and how they come together to form the specific area of your topic, and how that then creates a gap in the literature. So a couple of tips is to think about your literature review as a bit of a funnel. So you're taking your reader from a very wide, broad sense of knowledge, and in fact their own world that they live in, but remembering also that your examiners are going to be experts in this literature more than likely, and most probably there's a very good possibility that they will even know some of the researchers or the published authors that you'll be referring to. And in my study, one of the studies that I referred to, the lady that wrote it actually ended up being one of my external examiners. So there's, in any type of field, there isn't a massive amount, especially once you narrow it down, there aren't a massive amount of researchers, etc., that have that narrow level of interest. But you will then be successively narrowing and funneling your reader through into the path that they're going to take through your research study. And if you do that effectively and you demonstrate a gap and you show a grasp of the literature, then you've achieved what you want to achieve in your literature review. And importantly, what it will do is it will set up the rest of your study, because now after here you're going to go into the methodology section, which explains what method or process you're going to apply to do research, and then of course the results and the discussion and the conclusion, etc. And continuously throughout those sections, although not as extensively as in your literature review, you are going to refer back to the literature, because the literature again informs the context, academically speaking, of the work that you're doing. And very importantly, when you get to discussing the implications, application, and contribution of your work, it's going to have to be done once again with reference to the literature review, but more specifically the synthesis of these 3 areas and the gap that you identified originally in the literature. Right, so that's the literature review section of your final report.